Kneeling in the mud, she cleaned the pigsty with her bare hands. Not for a salary, not by choice, only for a plate of food, and the right not to sleep on the streets. No one saw, no one asked, until one man stopped his car, and for some reason couldn't bring himself to drive away. Stay until the end, because stories like this, where cruelty hides behind charity and indifference becomes routine, don't come around every day, and when they do, they remind us of what still needs to change. In the heart of rural Nigeria, where dirt roads stretch endlessly and dust settles on the windows before the sun even rises, lies a village long abandoned by progress. In that forgotten corner of the map lives Adama, a 23-year-old young woman whose name is rarely spoken and whose presence to many is as quiet as the wind that brushes through the dry cornfields. She was just a child when she lost her father, a humble motorcycle taxi driver, in a tragic accident on a narrow, unlit road where haste often turns deadly. A few months later, her mother, already weakened, succumbed to typhoid fever. Neighbors whispered prayers and brought food for a couple of days, then moved on with their lives. But Adama had nowhere else to go. Madame Oluwa, widow of a once prominent landowner, decided to take her in, a gesture praised by many in the village. Yet beneath that kindness lived another truth. Adama wasn't welcomed with celebration, or a prepared room, or even a name on the school roster. Over time, she understood. She wasn't part of the family. She was part of the labor, present but never belonging, and that invisible line was everywhere. She slept in a small room behind the house, tucked between the pantry and the chicken coop. The space, hastily arranged, had walls stained by age and a sagging mattress atop an old wooden frame. No decoration, no curtains. At night, she heard roosters crowing and the distant sounds of the bush. In the morning, she rose before anyone else, not out of obligation but habit, a body that already knew its place. Her meals were left beside the kitchen door, from the inside. There were no invitations to sit at the table. That truth was never spoken out loud, but it was taught through gestures. Food came without words, without questions, without conversation. She ate alone, quietly, with her head lowered, not from fear, but from routine, a kind of loneliness that doesn't scream, but quietly eats away at you, day by day. Still, she was diligent. She performed her chores with care, washing clothes, gathering fruit, feeding the animals, and yes, cleaning the pig pens with her bare hands, because gloves were a luxury. She did everything discreetly, as if not to disturb anyone, still holding on to a fragile hope that maybe one day someone might notice her. But the days went by, and no one saw her. The neighbors, long used to her quiet, slender figure, no longer questioned her presence. She had become part of the scenery, something there but never truly seen. The years stacked up like silence, and slowly Adama learned how to live without expecting anything. Here at African Village Story, every video is more than just a story. It's an experience that moves you, stays with you, and sometimes even changes you. If you believe that some stories deserve to be told, with truth, heart, and courage, subscribe now and turn on notifications, so you won't miss any twist of fate, any reunion that heals old wounds, or any life that finally finds its voice. About 400 kilometers away, far from the cracked roads baked by the sun and the backyards where dignity hides behind survival, the skyscrapers of Lagos reflect the shine of another universe. That's where Daniel Ajayi, 37, lives, a well-known name among agricultural investors. To the outside world, he's the picture of success. Tailored suits, climate-controlled meetings, lunches with CEOs, and silent nights in a penthouse overlooking the ocean. But for anyone who looks closely, there's something else in his eyes, a trace of loneliness carefully disguised. He was sent to a British boarding school as a child, shortly after his parents died in a plane crash, the kind of tragedy that makes headlines one day and is forgotten the next. He grew up surrounded by protocols and pressure, learning early to perform like an adult, to mask pain with results, to answer everything with numbers and never with feelings. Over the years, he accumulated titles, companies, properties, shares, but never family photos on the desk, never letters, never hugs. He built his entire life with discipline and long-term vision, but without ever knowing for whom or why. That morning, he left a high-stakes meeting with foreign investors. Hours of negotiating mergers, exports, and new market strategies. Everything went smoothly. Everyone smiled. And yet, As others raised their glasses to celebrate, something inside him remained quiet. In the car, heading home, he realized just how much of his life had become a pattern of perfect routines and vague purpose. The city lights flashed by, but none of them spoke to him. They only mirrored what he'd become inside, structured and empty. The one to break that rhythm was his regional manager, a man a bit too enthusiastic for Daniel's taste, but undeniably efficient. Between spreadsheets and projections, he mentioned an old farm in the countryside, fertile land, irrigation potential, low acquisition cost, and an entire village around it still untouched by development. "It's far," the man said, "but it could be a strategic move." Then he joked, "Maybe you need a change of scenery too, don't you think?" Daniel replied with a polite smile, but inside, with a quiet exhaustion. Deep down, he wasn't interested in the land or the deal. What tempted him was the chance to get away, even just for a day or two. Breathe different air, see the countryside, sleep without city noise. When he agreed to the trip, it wasn't for the opportunity. It was for the silence, and perhaps without knowing a hidden need to see something he hadn't yet understood. 2 days later, the luxury car was already on the road. Miles of smooth asphalt gave way to dirt as cell signal began to fade. The scenery changed slowly. Lagos disappeared behind him, and modernity gave way to dust, crooked trees, and clay houses. Through the window, he watched barefoot children playing by the roadside, women washing clothes in rivers, men pulling wooden carts. These weren't images of misery. They were scenes of real life, life that few ever talked about anymore. The GPS failed as they reached a village with no nameplate. The driver continued with the help of a boy who offered directions in exchange for a cold bottle of water. Red earth coated everything. It felt like another continent within his own country. The air was dry, the smells unfamiliar. Daniel felt something stir in his chest, not discomfort, awareness. He was standing in a world that had always existed parallel to his and that he had never truly seen. When they arrived at the farm, they found a modest, aging structure with sagging fences and silences between sounds. Nothing about it screamed profit. In fact, the whole place felt frozen in time. Still, he stepped out of the car, shook the owner's hand and smiled. Her name was Madame Oluwa, a widow, stern. She spoke with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. She proudly showed the land, even with its dry fields and empty pens, spoke of better days, of a husband long gone, of children who had left, and of the value of what remained. "This land isn't for just anyone," she warned. Daniel listened patiently, but something in the distance pulled his attention. A movement near the animal pens, a figure crouched in the mud, small, kneeling, cleaning something with bare hands. She didn't look like a worker, and definitely not like family. A shiver ran down his neck, along with the sudden feeling that this trip wouldn't be just another line on a quarterly report. Have you ever felt like no one truly saw you? If so, share with us in the comments. Maybe your story is exactly what someone else in the world needs to hear right now. Sometimes a simple sentence like, "I've felt that way too," can bring more comfort than 1,000 words. After 3 days driving down increasingly deserted roads, Daniel's black car finally passed through the makeshift gate of the farm. The air was drier there. Dust clung to the hood. The trees looked tired, and the wind carried the scent of earth, sun, and silence. Even before the engine stopped, something on the left side of the landscape caught his attention. He was still wearing his sunglasses, but it only took that outline, that blurred image, for the investor's thoughts, usually so focused on numbers, to halt for the first time in days. A young woman, seemingly in her early 20s, knelt beside a crude pigsty. Her clothes, faded and clinging to her body from the dirt, nearly blended with the mud itself. Her hands moved with strange precision, firm, agile, as if this were her daily routine, but with a delicacy that didn't belong in that place. No sudden movements, no hesitation. It was as if she cleaned with her soul absent, but her dignity intact, and somehow that disturbed him. Further ahead, the sharp voice of an older woman echoed with harshness, short commands, cold instructions, an impatient tone. The distance blurred the exact words, but the sound was enough. It was authority without affection, presence without respect. The woman wore a long, wrinkled dress and gestured with a thin stick, perhaps a cane, perhaps just for show. Around her, no one intervened. Workers passed by quickly. A dog barked in the distance. The scene, likely routine for those who lived there, seemed absurd to someone arriving from a completely different world. For a few moments, Daniel stood still, one hand still resting on the car door. No visible shock crossed his face. It was a quiet discomfort, deep and unsettling, like a shiver with no clear cause. This wasn't what he had expected to see, and perhaps because of that, he couldn't simply look away. His mind tried to rationalize. She must be a worker. Maybe they can't afford proper equipment. Could be an isolated case. But the look in that woman's eyes refused to fit into any of those excuses. What struck him most wasn't the filth, or even the situation itself. It was the gaze. There was an absence of hope so sincere it hurt. No plea, no shame. Just a quiet acceptance of a condition imposed far too long ago. The kind of gaze that no longer begs, because it's already learned the world only listens to those who scream loudly, and she clearly didn't scream. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the main house, trying to regain focus. This was supposed to be a business meeting after all. Land assessment, structural analysis, negotiation. The house was old but tidy. Faded portraits hung on the walls, heavy furniture filled the space, and the scent of stored food lingered. Madame Oluwa greeted him with a half smile and a dry handshake, the kind given by someone who's long stopped offering anything beyond formality. The conversation began as expected. Production costs, past harvests, irrigation problems, hopeful plans for revitalization. Midway through the explanation, Daniel asked, "The young woman by the pigsty, does she work here?" Madame smiled but didn't answer right away. It was as if she enjoyed his curiosity. "Ah, Adama. She's been here since she was little. Helps with everything. Quiet girl, doesn't cause trouble. She eats and sleeps. No reason to complain." The line was delivered with a sense of pride, as if offering a convenient, though irrelevant, fact. But in that moment, her indifference shouted louder than any scream. Daniel didn't react. He kept listening, as though nothing had been said, but something inside him had already shifted. The image of Adama kneeling in the mud was now fixed in his mind, and not as a passing detail. It felt like a mirror had been placed in front of him, revealing everything that had always slipped past unnoticed. Everything the world's eyes had been trained not to see. For the rest of the visit, his gaze often returned to the window. The landscape outside seemed to be trying to speak, and for the first time in a long while, he wanted to listen. There are things we don't believe until we see them with our own eyes. Daniel witnessed something that felt impossible in today's world, and it changed him from the inside out. And you? Have you ever seen or experienced something that made you rethink the world? If so, share in the comments. I've been through something like that. What marked you might still awaken someone else. Claro, abaixo está a tradução completa e fiel do trecho A Mesa e o Peso do Silêncio, com a mesma cadência, emocional tom realista e linguagem cinematográfica, seguida pela chamada para comentários adaptada ao inglês com o mesmo peso e sutileza. The table and the weight of silence lunch was served with simplicity, but there was a certain care in how the plates were arranged. The dark wooden table, worn at the edges by time, sat at the back porch of the main house, facing dry fields and silent pens. Madame Oluwa took the seat at the head of the table as if she naturally assumed control, even over meals. Across from her, Daniel observed everything with a sensitivity he wasn't used to admitting. On the table, well-cooked rice, grilled fish, and a dish of yam leaves. The food was good, typical country fare, but he barely touched his fork. Instead, his eyes wandered across the surroundings. A worker passed by in the distance, pushing a wheelbarrow. An old dog lay beneath the shade, and throughout the entire path since his arrival, Adama had not appeared again. "Everything all right with the meal, Mr. Daniel?" Madame Oluwa asked, raising her eyes briefly. He forced a polite smile and nodded. "It's excellent. Very well prepared." She gave a small, formal nod and returned to her plate in silence. The sound of cutlery blended with the faint song of a bird somewhere nearby. At one point, Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, as if about to steer the conversation in a new direction. He drew a slow breath. "The young woman I saw earlier, by the pigsty, Adama, right?" Madame paused. She didn't look up, but she also didn't seem bothered. She simply kept chewing, as if weighing whether or not the question mattered. "Yes, that's her name." Daniel waited, thinking she might elaborate, but silence returned, so he asked again, with a more neutral tone, "Has she been working with you for long?" Now she put her utensils down slowly, dabbed her mouth with a napkin, and replied in the tone one might use to describe a piece of equipment. Since she was little, she lives here, helps with everything. The words came with no sentiment, just utility. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the edge of the table, careful not to let any expression betray what he was feeling. Does she have any family in the area? His voice was softer this time, almost conversational. Madame offered a faint smile, one without warmth. Family, not that I know of. When she arrived, she had no one. Silence again. Then, with a little more firmness, not affection but certainty, she added, "She eats, sleeps, has a roof over her head. She's not a child, she could have left if she wanted to." Daniel didn't answer right away. He took a sip of water and looked out at the fields where the sunlight turned the leaves brittle, like old paper. He thought about how some phrases can sound perfectly rational and still carry a kind of cruelty so subtle it slips by unnoticed. "I see." The conversation ended there. Madame returned to her plate. Daniel simply moved his food around, but his appetite had vanished. One line kept echoing inside him. She could have left if she wanted to, as if freedom were just a door left open and not an invisible cage built from silence, fear, and lack of options. Lunch ended the same way it began, with politeness and distance. Madame Olua stood and wished him well with the rest of his visit, said he was free to walk around and that if he wanted to review the acquisition offer, the papers were ready. Daniel thanked her, shook her hand, and stepped down the porch steps slower than necessary. In the distance, a metal bucket fell to the ground, a dry sound but full of weight. It was as if the land itself had whispered, "Keep looking," and he did. Some words sound normal until you really listen. Have you ever heard something that seemed simple, but stayed with you for all the wrong reasons? Share in the comments. That phrase stuck with me, because sometimes what hurts isn't the scream, it's the routine. The morning came colder than usual. The sky, veiled by a layer of thin clouds, cast a pale light over the land, as if the day itself had awakened in silence. Daniel arrived early, unannounced. He asked to see the stables, though he wasn't entirely sure why. There was something about that land that kept pulling him back, and it had nothing to do with agriculture. The driver stopped near the old feed barn. Daniel got out alone. The sounds of the farm were still waking up. Buckets scraping, hurried footsteps, a distant radio playing a half-forgotten tune. When the gate creaked, he turned his head, and there she was. Just a few meters away, by the pigsty, a dama, kneeling, curled up. Her hands moved steadily between crooked boards, cleaning as she had the day before. The scene looked the same, but it wasn't. Something in the air, maybe the fatigue, maybe the chill, made it feel heavier, and her, smaller. Daniel didn't rush. He watched for a moment, respecting the space, took a deep breath, then began walking, slowly, each step careful, as if approaching a wounded bird that might still fly. As he drew closer, she sensed him, lifted her face. Their eyes met for just a few seconds, deep, steady, but empty of reaction. Then, slowly, her gaze dropped again. He stopped at a respectful distance, his heart beating faster than expected. He wasn't sure what to do, or why exactly he was there. He just knew he needed to be. "Are you all right?" The question came out softer than he'd planned, sincere, but gentle, without pressure. No answer, only the sound of the bucket shifting. She didn't move, just stayed there, as if waiting for the rain to pass. Daniel hesitated, looked around, no one nearby. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, pulled out a white handkerchief, clean, finely stitched with his initials embroidered, one of those details passed down through habit and legacy. He took 2 steps closer, paused, then knelt slowly beside her. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just kept her eyes low. With quiet care, he extended his hand, gently wiped a bit of dried mud from her cheek. It was a small gesture, yet in that world, it felt like an act of quiet rebellion. Her eyes lifted again, met his. This time, something was different, a flicker of surprise, as if such kindness didn't belong in the world she knew. They had no words. There was no language for this. Then slowly, she reached out, took the handkerchief from his fingers, and without a word, stood up and walked away. Not running, just leaving quickly, like someone who doesn't know what to do with what they've just felt. Daniel remained there, still kneeling, watching the dust rise softly from the ground she had just walked across. The handkerchief was gone, but what mattered most was what remained. In that moment, something had taken root. An invisible thread spun in silence. fragile as glass, but real, and he knew this was only the beginning. When love resists, even in silence, it speaks louder than words. Did you feel it too? Drop a heart in the comments. Sometimes a simple symbol says everything we can't. The city lights surrounded him again, but no longer filled him. Lagos kept its frantic rhythm, horns, buildings, people in a hurry who never looked each other in the eyes. Daniel sat in meetings, signed contracts, smiled at investors, but something inside had slipped out of place. The image of Adama, with her face half wiped clean by a handkerchief and eyes full of silence, returned every night. Sometimes during breakfast, he'd stop stirring his coffee mid-motion as if still kneeling in the dirt beside her. He made a few discreet calls, spoke to 2 contacts in the Northern Land Registry. No formal record of labor at that farm, no document issued in Adama's name. Nothing. It was as if she didn't exist to the state, and maybe never truly existed to anyone. That realization brought something new, anger, but a quiet kind, the kind that burns inward and rearranges your purpose. 2 weeks later, he announced he was heading back to the property, told the partners he needed to reassess logistics. No one questioned it. The truth was, even he didn't know exactly what he was searching for. He just knew he couldn't stay where he was, not as he was. There was a growing unease that wouldn't go away, and it was calling him. He arrived unannounced. The heat felt stronger that morning, the sky too clean, the fields just as dry as before. Dust rose along the sides of the truck. When the farm gate appeared, his heart raced, not out of excitement. It was anxiety, fear, and a strange premonition that something had already changed. He stepped out alone, searched the surroundings. No sign of Adama. Not near the barns, not in the stables. A bitter feeling sank into his stomach, the kind that tells you might be too late. He called one of the workers. The man averted his gaze and muttered that she wasn't around. Another rushed off quickly, as if the air had grown too heavy. Then he saw Madalena. The elderly woman, wearing a stained apron and sunken eyes, was drying her hands on an old rag. When Daniel approached, he didn't need to ask. She already knew what he wanted to know. "The girl?" she whispered. "The mistress thought you were taking an interest in her." She paused, looked around. No one nearby. "Locked her in the barn. Said if she spoke to you again, she'd pay for it." Daniel stood frozen. For a few seconds, the world around him vanished. The wind brushing through the dry grass now sounded like a muffled scream. The same indignation he had felt in Lagos returned, but sharper now. This time, there was guilt, because in touching Adama, even gently, he had exposed a wound she had carried alone, and now she was paying the price. "And where is she now?" Madalena shrugged, her eyes damp. When she saw the mistress coming with the key, she jumped out the back window, vanished. They say she took the trail behind the fields. No one's seen her since. A strange silence fell. Daniel took a step back, tried to picture Adama running through the fields, barefoot, frightened, with no idea where to go, only desperate not to stay. He took a deep breath, looked down at the ground, then toward the horizon, and in that moment, he understood. What had begun as curiosity had turned into responsibility. There was no returning to his life and pretending none of this had happened. Her absence now echoed, louder than her presence. Some forms of abuse leave no visible scars, but they wound just the same. Sometimes control comes dressed as care, and only those who've lived it know the weight. Have you ever gone through something like this? Type in the comments. It took me a while to see it. Your courage might help someone else recognize their own prison. The farm looked even drier that morning, as if it had lost its last drop of hope, along with Adama. Daniel stood frozen for long seconds after hearing Madalena's words. She jumped out the back window. No one's seen her since. That sentence echoed in his mind like a quiet hammer. For the first time, it wasn't just outrage, it was guilt. He didn't sleep that night, just sat in the car, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the gate. He pictured her running with no direction, barefoot, frightened, not escaping the farm, but a life that was never hers, and he thought of how different things could have been if he hadn't arrived too late. He didn't share what he felt, but inside a decision had already been made. Return to Lagos? Pretend it was just another rural case? That option was no longer on the table. At sunrise, he drove to a nearby village, began asking questions, carefully, avoiding attention. Mentioned Adama's name softly, showing the old handkerchief she had once held. Most people didn't know. A few averted their eyes. By the second day, he changed strategy. He went to a small local market and asked about former workers. From the farm, used the name Madame Olua. Finally, an old man, slow in speech but sharp in memory, gave him 3 names. People who had worked there long ago and left because they couldn't take it anymore. He found the first, a man named Solomon, sitting under a cashew tree mending a fishing net. The second, Peter, now drove a motorcycle taxi. The third, Ruth, sold bean fritters at the market. And when she heard the name Adama, her eyes filled with tears before her mouth could speak. She was just a child, didn't say much, but her eyes were always begging for help, Ruth said, adjusting the scarf on her head. She got quieter with time. The madam would say she was grateful, but that was never gratitude. It was fear. With humility and honesty, Daniel asked for help, explained what he had seen, admitted that even though he didn't fully know Adama's story, he couldn't sleep knowing she was out there, maybe hurt, maybe lost, maybe simply invisible. I know I don't have the right to ask, but she needs to be found. And I don't trust anyone more than those who know that land and that pain. The 3 exchanged glances. Ruth nodded first. That afternoon they formed a kind of search team, split the local map into zones, retraced old trails, stopped by springs, alleys, shelters, even abandoned churches. Peter lent a motorbike. Solomon brought an old pair of binoculars. Ruth cooked and packed food for the next 2 days. Daniel, always in tailored suits, changed into a plain shirt and borrowed work pants. For the first time, he left behind the role of investor. Among people who had suffered far more than he ever had, he was just another man trying to right what should never have gone wrong. That night, while they reviewed the search plan over an old map, Ruth said something Daniel would never forget. She didn't run because of fear. She ran because she didn't know there was someone who would come back for her. And right there, under the soft glow of a kerosene lamp, he made a silent vow. This story wouldn't end like this. Sometimes all someone needs is to know there's someone who'd come back for them. If this part of the story moved you, write in the comments, I would come back, because there are people out there who even in silence are still waiting to be found. The road to the small house was made of red dirt, lined with tall eucalyptus trees and the kind of silence that carries more weight than words. Daniel didn't choose a luxury hotel. He took Adama to a place where no one would ask questions, a simple, isolated house where time seemed to move more slowly. Wooden shutters creaked in the wind. In the backyard, a few chickens wandered aimlessly. An old well stood as a silent witness. There was no luxury there, but there was peace, and in that moment, that was what mattered most. She hesitated before entering. Her dirty feet marked the light-colored floor. Her eyes scanned every corner, as if afraid to touch something. That wasn't hers. When Daniel pointed to the bathroom, she pulled back. After a few seconds, she stepped in with small, hesitant steps. Moments later, the sound of warm water running brought silent relief. For the first time in years, she felt clean, scrubbed her arms hard as if trying to erase the past. She wiped her face with her hands. When she came out, her eyes were less opaque, but still wordless. On the table, there was white rice, fresh beans, and 2 eggs fried with onions. A simple meal, but the smell awakened something old inside her. She sat down quietly, ate slowly. Each bite seemed to confirm that it was real. When she finished, she glanced at Daniel, who watched in silence, respecting every unspoken boundary. He didn't ask, didn't push, just waited. And that, more than any kind words, began to melt something inside. That night, Daniel offered her the bed. She refused, lay down on the floor, on a blanket he had spread, said only that she was used to it. Over the next few nights she did the same, even with an empty bed beside her, even with the cold creeping in. But with each sunrise something changed. Her breathing grew softer, her eyes less guarded. Fear began to give way, first to strangeness, then to possibility. One afternoon, with a light drizzle falling, they were organizing some old books Daniel had stored in boxes. She paused on one of them, a worn-out African literature book, held it longer than the others. The title seemed familiar. He noticed. They sat at the table, and with a soft, almost whispered voice, she began to speak. When I was little, I liked to read. School was far, but I went. I dreamed of being a teacher. I had a teacher named Neka. She used to say my handwriting looked like dancing. It was the first time he heard a memory from her that wasn't covered in pain. And in that moment, he understood. The true rescue started there. Not when she was taken from the farm, but when she began to remember that she existed before. The pain. In the following weeks, Adama began to explore the house more naturally, tended the plants in the yard, ironed clothes with care, read in silence when she thought he wasn't watching, and now and then she smiled. Not much, but enough to reveal that behind the dirt, the escape and the silence, there was a whole soul, still alive, still capable of starting again. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer the only thing inside her. Every woman carries a world inside, even when the world insists on tearing her down. If this part of the story moved you, write in the comments #strength for Adama, because every time a woman rises, we all gain a little more hope. Daniel didn't return to that land just with intentions. He came back with a decision. After weeks of gathering documents, running calculations, and consulting legal advisors, he officially bought the farm where Adama had been kept for so many years. But unlike what many expected, he didn't keep it. On the Yaudi day of the signing in front of the city registry office, with a small group of witnesses and human rights representatives, Daniel transferred the property directly into Adama's name. The news spread like wildfire. When Madame Olua heard about the transaction, she believed she'd at least have the money from the sale to move on with her life, but fate had other plans. Daniel's lawyers filed labor lawsuits on behalf of Adama and other workers who, for years, had worked without rights, contracts, or dignity. The judge ordered that the proceeds from the sale be frozen for compensation and fines. In the end, the woman who once controlled lives with arrogance had to work to support herself, cooking at events in nearby villages and depending on relatives she used to scorn. The case gained traction in the local media. Newspapers in Lagos, rural radio stations, social media. Videos from the day Adama received the title to the farm went viral. Other landowners were pressured to legalize their workers. Oversight agencies, once negligent, began to act more strictly, and unintentionally Adama became a symbol of resistance. Her image, serene eyes, firm posture, appeared in campaigns against slave labor and in interviews about survival and resilience. But the life she chose was not one of spotlights. She preferred the quiet path of rebuilding, returned to school, enrolled in a GED program, and began frequenting the public library. She read voraciously, rewrote her past by studying the present. She loved learning. Occasionally, she joined conversation circles with rural girls where she shared her story, not as a victim, but as living proof that pain, when embraced, can become strength. Daniel, meanwhile, returned to Lagos, resumed his routine, his responsibilities, and his reports. But something had changed. The image of Adama, now confident, smiling, whole, began to fill his thoughts constantly. It was no longer about responsibility or pity. It was something new, beautiful, calm, a desire to be close, not to save but to share. And that made him return to the farm whenever possible, not out of duty, but out of longing. Adama had changed too. Her gaze no longer held fear, but light. And every time he appeared at the house's porch, her heart settled. Over time, silence turned into words, distance turned into touch, and care turned into love. Months later, before a few close friends and under an old tree in the backyard of their new home, they said yes to each other. No extravagance, no grand promises, just yes to what they felt, to what they had overcome, to what they chose to build together. One day, while organizing a box of old papers stored on a shelf in the old farmhouse, Adama came across a yellowed photo. It was tucked inside a folder full of old receipts, a picture of herself as a baby. Her face was recognizable, the same eyes, but what struck her most was what was written on the back, in simple, trembling handwriting. "I love you, my daughter, and I will find you one day. Ifunaya." Adama sat on the floor with the photo in her hands. Time seemed to pause. Those words opened a new emptiness, or perhaps a new path. Who was Ifunaya? How did that image end up in Madame Oluwa's drawer? Why would she keep something like that? Her eyes filled with tears, but not of sadness. It was as if part of a forgotten story had started whispering back. Because some answers don't belong to the past. They arrive when the heart is ready to hear. Don't miss the second part of this story. The truth about Adama's past and the secret behind the name written with such love may change everything you thought you knew. Stay tuned for the next video and prepare yourself for a reunion that could transform more than one destiny. See you there.